On an autumn night in 1541, behind the gilded latticework of Topkapi Palace, a girl just 12 years old was dressed in crimson silk, her wrists trembling inside sleeves threaded with gold. Historians rarely speak her name. Official records call it a royal marriage, a celebration even. But in whispered corridors of Istanbul, what unfolded that evening was known by another name, the first night. Some say she screamed. Others say she waited in silence, lips bitten raw beneath the veil. At the center was a princess of the Ottoman bloodline, barely a child, sold to politics in the body of a bride. Her fear marked the beginning of a ritual carefully hidden by court poets and imperial scribes for centuries. For 600 years, what happened behind those filigreed doors was censored, erased, denied. But the stories still survive. In secret letters, in foreign accounts, in the memories of eunuchs who swore never to speak. If you're listening to this at night, remember, history's darkest secrets often echo louder after midnight. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from right now. In the Ottoman Empire, power was currency, but for princesses, their bodies were the bank. Unlike their brothers, who were trained in warfare and governance, daughters were groomed not for the battlefield, but for the bedroom. By the age of 10, most were already versed in palace etiquette, modest silence, and the art of veiling terror with painted smiles. Their destinies were inked not with ink, but with blood. Dynastic blood, exchanged to keep alliances breathing. The irony? They were of imperial birth, yet had no voice over their own lives. The harem, often romanticized in Western lore, was not a garden of pleasure but a golden cage, one where the scent of jasmine couldn't mask the decay of stolen girlhoods. Every corridor whispered rumors of consummation ceremonies, of gifts sent to sultans in the dead of night, of young brides returned with blood on silk sheets as proof of purity. Yet no one speaks of the ones who didn't scream, who simply vanished behind a curtain and never returned. In 1574, when Sultan Selim II died of a drunken fall, slipping in his bath after too much Cypriot wine, it wasn't just the empire that changed hands. His death triggered a chain reaction deep within the imperial harem, where young princesses, sisters, and nieces of the new sultan found themselves repurposed overnight. One of them was Fatma Sultan, just 14, whose engagement was announced a mere 3 days after the mourning period began. The man chosen for her? A 60-year-old pasha known more for his appetite than his battlefield success. Fatma had never seen his face, only heard of his cruelty, whispered between the veils of her handmaidens. She wasn't being wed. She was being strategically removed, gifted like a jeweled dagger to curry loyalty. The first night remained a silent thundercloud above her head, a terror wrapped in ceremonial incense and gold-threaded robes. No cleric asked for her consent. No lyric celebrated her choice. The empire did not require her happiness, only her hymen. And when she did not bleed, they said the sheets were stained anyway. No blood? No problem. The eunuchs knew how to manufacture proof when needed. Silence was survival. And survival, for an Ottoman princess, often meant becoming a ghost at your own wedding. To understand the terror that gripped these girls on their wedding night, we must descend into the architecture of the palace itself. The Topkapi was not just stone and tile, it was a labyrinth of surveillance. Hidden passageways connected chambers to hallways where the steps of eunuchs echoed like omens. Eyes watched from behind lattice walls. Even the silence had weight. For an Ottoman princess, privacy ended the moment her engagement was announced. From then on, she was property. Her meals monitored, her tutors reassigned, her childhood companions removed. A concubine scholar once described the first night chamber as a room carved out of time, lit by oil lamps and perfumed with camphor to hide the scent of fear. The bridal bed? A stage. The groom, often a stranger, was satisfied first, and the act was inspected later. Sheets were folded, examined, archived, and if no blood appeared, the shame could swallow a princess whole. Some tried to cut themselves beforehand. Some were taught how by older women who wanted to spare them humiliation. But no one was taught how to survive what came after, when the door closed, and the palace moved on as if nothing had happened. But the cruelty did not end with the first night. It only recalibrated. In the days that followed, the princess was judged not only on her blood, but on her demeanor. Smile too little, and she was cold. Weep too much, and she was hysterical. If her husband lost favor, she was blamed. If he rose too soon, she was suspicious. She lived inside a moral maze where every breath was measured, and every bruise disguised as honor. Some princesses vanished into provincial exile, married off to governors far from the capital, never to see the gleam of Istanbul's minarets again. Others, favored for their fertility or docility, bore sons who would one day be strangled in velvet sacks by their uncles, according to the cruel logic of succession. The real tragedy? The daughters of the empire were forbidden from wielding swords, but trained to endure them, in silence, in sacrifice, in the dark. As if that was their divine duty, as if their suffering was part of some celestial order. The stories that escaped these gilded prisons did so in fragments, scraps caught in the margins of foreign diplomats' letters, smuggled into diaries by Venetian spies, or etched into the memories of renegade palace scribes. One such fragment tells of Mihrimah Sultan, beloved daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, who allegedly delayed her marriage for 4 entire years, not by rebellion, but by pleading illness, by building mosques and schools to justify her presence in the capital. Some say she feigned melancholy, whispering tearful verses to her attendants until the court astrologers warned of bad omens if the wedding proceeded. Whether out of love or calculation, her tactics bought her time, a rare commodity for women whose first night could be their last sane one. Yet even Mihrimah, the exception, could not rewrite the rules. When she finally wed, it was still in silence, still under watch, still without the soft mercy of consent. The empire applauded, the poets praised, but behind closed doors, another girl disappeared, folded into history like a letter she never got to write. Even the preparations for the first night were rituals steeped in unspoken dread. A week before, the princess was moved to a separate chamber, a cold, echoing room stripped of childhood's final softness. Her body was oiled, her hair scented with rosewater, and her silence rehearsed by elder women who'd already survived their own ordeals. They spoke not of love or tenderness, but of compliance and containment. One wrong word, one glance of resistance, could ruin not just her marriage, but her fate. Servants brought ceremonial garments soaked in superstition, belts woven with talismans, bracelets etched with verses from the Quran, to protect a girl they would not protect. On the day of, she was painted like a doll, paraded through marble corridors as music played too sweetly, too slowly, masking what lay ahead. Behind the celebration lurked a trauma, the palace dressed in flowers. It was a performance where only one actor knew the script, and she was the one who didn't choose the role. Under the flickering lamps and scripted blessings, she became something other than human. A symbol, a sacrifice, an offering left on the altar of empire. And by the time the curtain fell, Who she had been was already a memory, fading like smoke through the palace walls. But what of those who refused? Those rare daughters of Ottoman blood who tried to carve silence into resistance. One story survives, buried under centuries of deliberate omission. Ayşe Sultan, a cousin to Murad IV, was said to have bitten the hand of the eunuch who came to escort her to the bridal chamber. Reports say she locked herself in a prayer room, reciting the surahs of protection until her voice broke. For 3 nights, she delayed the ceremony. On the 4th, she was drugged. The chronicles call it a healing draught. But foreign observers, reading between the tightly stitched lines, read it for what it was, a silencing potion. Ayşe lived, but in every portrait that remained, she is never shown smiling, her eyes drawn like shadows too deep to fill. Her groom died 2 years later under suspicious conditions, though no inquiry was launched. The palace buried the incident, renamed her chambers, reassigned her attendants. Officially, the first night had gone as planned. In truth, Ayşe proved that even within empire, fear was not always obedience, that some ghosts do not vanish, they haunt. And centuries later, when we dare to listen, we can still hear them whisper through the walls. The empire may have written their stories in silence, but memory, like blood on silk, leaves a stain that will not wash away. By the early 1600s, as the shadows of intrigue lengthened over Topkapi, something darker took root within the empire, an unspoken policy of weaponized marriages. Princesses were not just wed for diplomacy now, they were wed for silence. The more dangerous the secret, the more tightly a girl was bound to a man too grateful or too frightened to betray it. Some princesses were paired with informants, local governors, or men known for their loyalty to the throne, all chosen not for affection, but for their discretion. The empire didn't trust its daughters. Instead, it orchestrated their erasure. Every veil was a gag. Every wedding procession, a funeral march for the self. Once, records whisper of a veiled figure weeping blood beneath her wedding crown, an image so stark, so grotesque, it was banned from court poetry for generations. She had scratched her own face just hours before the ceremony, begging the court physician for disfigurement so she might be spared. She wasn't. The wedding went on. Applause echoed down the marble halls. But the image remained. The blood, the veil, the silence. And it has haunted the empire's ghosted corners ever since, asking a single question that no history book dares answer. What was the price of beauty when survival demanded invisibility? By the time the 17th century waned and the empire staggered under the weight of its own contradictions, the ceremonial first night had become less about union and more about containment. Love had no place in its choreography. Neither did pleasure. It was a ritual exorcism, meant to banish autonomy from the bodies of royal women before it could take root. Some princesses vanished into happy illusions, pretending their grooms were gods or poets. Others retreated inward, their smiles petrified relics of internal collapse. And yet, beneath the silken layers of politics and performance, a quiet rebellion unfolded in the dark. A cracked mirror here, a torn veil there, a lullaby sung backward in a forgotten dialect. These were their weapons, small, desperate, and invisible to imperial eyes, but real. Perhaps they knew they wouldn't be remembered with crowns or titles. But even stripped of choice, even robbed of voice, they crafted an ancient intimacy with silence itself. And maybe that silence was the empire's greatest fear. Not the screams, not the stains, but the stillness that could not be written away. History tried to forget them. but they are waiting. In the curtains, in the corridors, in the soft hush between night and dawn. You can still hear them, if you listen closely. And if you're listening to this after midnight, remember, some secrets were never meant to stay asleep. And so, the chronicles remain quiet, their silences heavier than their words. No ballads were composed for these brides, no monuments carved their names. Yet beneath the clamor of empire, beneath the echo of swords and council proclamations, there exists a deeper pulse, a rhythm of anguish, of stolen will, of resigned breath. The first night was never truly a singular event. It was a sentence handed down at birth, delayed only by the ticking of palace clocks. It broke hearts in rooms where peacocks screamed and censers swung in perfumed lies. And though the empire fell, though marble crumbled and dynasties turned to dust, something lingers, a scent, a shadow, a memory. The Ottoman princesses may not have wielded power in scrolls or battles, but in their defiance, in their quiet rage, in the bloodless rebellions of the soul, they left a deeper mark. One too terrible to grant a page, too sacred to bury. In the end, their truth did not vanish. It waited, unheard but unyielding. So the next time history presents itself in gold leaf and glory, ask yourself, who paid the bride price for that magnificence? And what became of the girl beneath the crown, cuffed in silk and silence? Perhaps the most haunting legacy of all lies, not in the stories that were told, but in the questions that were never allowed to be asked. Why was silence rewarded and grief rehearsed? Why did the empire require its most sacred daughters to be sacrificed to protocol instead of protected by it? These questions dissolve under the weight of centuries, evade answers like shadows slipping through lattice screens. But one truth survives. The first night was not a mythical tradition, nor a ceremonial fantasy. It was an engineered theft of girlhood, systematized and sanctified. When we peel back the velvet curtains of empire, what we find is not only cruelty masquerading as culture, but a pattern repeated across dynasties, continents, and creeds. The horror doesn't belong to the Ottomans alone. It belongs to every system that saw daughters as dowries and pain as currency. And in that collective silence, the echo grows louder. So tonight, whether you listen in Istanbul or Indiana, remember, what history refuses to proclaim, memory preserves in whispers. Thank you for listening this far. And if you're still here after midnight, know this. Some ghosts do not seek justice. They simply demand to be known. Beneath the shimmering veils and diamond tiaras, beneath the sanctified rituals and official portraits, the empire's daughters carried a grief so dense it survived dynasties. We've traced their shadows through stone corridors and perfumed silences, through the oil lamps of history and the censored verses of forgotten poets. And now, as the palace lies silent, its ghosts unchanged by time, we must ask, what is memory but rebellion? Each girl stolen into womanhood beneath a wedding crown is more than a symbol. She is a cipher carved in silence, a soft scream layered in centuries. The Ottomans may have silenced their princesses, but they did not erase them. They linger not in archives, but in the questions still too terrifying to ask aloud. When rituals are wrapped in gold and justified by legacy, who speaks for the child inside the bride? You have heard their story. You now carry their echo. And maybe that is the beginning of justice. Not in courtrooms, not in textbooks, but in remembrance, in the knowing. If this is the hour after midnight, then let this final breath be your candle. What history buried, memory has resurrected, and she is still whispering. So when we speak of Ottoman grandeur, of domes and drums and crimson banners fluttering beneath golden crescents, let us not forget what they concealed. Beneath that majesty stood girls in locked rooms, barely more than children, waiting for footsteps that would reshape their fates in silence. No empire was built without sacrifice, but some sacrifices were never honored, only hidden. 6 centuries have passed, yet the weight of those nights still lingers, not in palatial marble or the echoes of cannon fire, but in the breathless pause before a locked door opens, in the stories whispered by women who were told not to speak, in the questions that history tiptoes around like landmines. So listen again, not with your ears, but with your bones. Their story may have ended in silence, but your remembering may be the loudest thing they ever had. And if you are hearing this now, after the clocks have struck 12, know this: every empire leaves behind ghosts. Some beg for peace, others beg to be believed. And in the hush that follows this long unwinding of shadows, we are left with a truth more piercing than any blade drawn in conquest. History protects its victors, but ignores its victims. The Ottoman princesses were not collateral. They were calculated offerings, pressed into gold and forgotten beneath empire's triumph. Their fears were not exceptional. They were expected. And while sultans are remembered in serenades and battle songs, their daughters drift nameless through footnotes, their suffering blurred into ceremonial pageantry. Yet here, in the uttering of their untold agony, they are seen, not as wives or pawns or rituals, but as witnesses to the darkest theater of legacy. If you're still here, after the hour has stretched thin with silence, let this be your vigil. Light a candle, not for the grandeur of kings, but for the invisible girls who wept behind embroidered veils, their blood-watered roots deeper than marble. Their silence was not consent, it was survival. And through remembrance, at last, they rise. This is where we draw the veil closed, but not in silence, not anymore. Because in every era, every empire, there are those who disappear and those who dare to remember them. The Ottoman princesses, silenced for 6 centuries, now speak, not through proclamations or restored titles, but through the cracked echoes of pain finally recognized. Their first nights were not myths, but mechanisms of state-sanctioned trauma. And while their names may fade from scrolls, their breath continues in our reckoning. If you have listened this far, if you have felt the weight of their voicelessness settle heavy on your chest, then you are no longer just a listener. You are a witness, and history, for once, must answer to you. Light that candle, speak that name, break that silence, for the girl beneath the crown, waiting in the dark, still listens. And now, so do you. So let this final image linger, not of domes or swords, but of a single oil lamp flickering in a chamber where no one knocks, where jasmine disguises what justice forgot. Let it linger in the silence of girls reciting courage into cracked mirrors, in the footsteps hushed by centuries, in the blood that never dried on embroidered silk. For the Ottoman princesses, the first night was never the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the end of their childhood, signed in rituals too cruel for records and too sacred for forgetting. If you heard their story under the cloak of midnight, then carry it with you into the harsh light of morning. Remember their fear, honor their silence, question the echoes masquerading as tradition. This history is not dust, it is inheritance. And tonight, it has passed into your hands. Keep it safe. Let no one close this book again without knowing who paid for its pages. The veil may fall, but the truth remains, untamed and unforgotten. And so, if tonight you lie awake, haunted not by the noise of the world, but by its silences, know this: history is not carved only in stone or ink. It lives in breath held too long, in footsteps swallowed by opulent hallways, in glances exchanged beneath veils, never lifted by love. The first nights of the Ottoman princesses were not ceremonies, they were elegies, for agency, for innocence, for lives lost in the name of legacy. In remembering them, we do not just grieve, we resist, against forgetting, against repetition, against the comfort of myths that perfume power's cruelty. And if this story found you in darkness, let it be your lantern. Let it burn quietly but relentlessly, like the girls who dwelled in dusk, unnamed but unbeaten. Close your eyes if you must, but do not shut your heart. The empire silenced them. We do not have to. Pass their story forward, like a secret too dangerous to keep buried. Let memory do what empire never did. Listen. In the end, what echoes is not just a lament for stolen girlhood, but a reckoning with how power rewrites womanhood into obedience. The tale of the Ottoman princesses is not some distant relic, buried in ancient courts and incense smoke. It is a mirror held to the present, where silence is still demanded in gold-threaded tones. Their stories, though sealed in time, whisper into every culture that masks coercion as custom, sacrifice as sanctity. We end this journey not with closure, but with a key, a permission to question, to mourn, to challenge history's selective memory. The first night was not just their fate. It was a ritual of forgetting, designed to make us look away. But you didn't. You listened. And perhaps that is where healing begins, not in rewriting history, but in unearthing it, raw and unadorned. Keep the light on. Let your memory be defiance. Let your attention be the justice they were denied. For in every girl trapped behind a veil of silence, past or present, there is a voice still waiting to be heard. And now, we hear it.